This story was made for exactly that moment when the world goes quiet and you're ready to hear something that will change how you see history forever. People are watching this from New York, from London, it's from Lagos and Lahore and Los Angeles, from kitchen tables and living room couches and late-night bedrooms with the door closed. Drop your city and your time in the comments. Let's see just how far this story travels now. Are you ready? Because what you're about to hear is not a fairy tale. It's not a legend dressed up to sound bigger than it was. Every card that was dealt, every dollar that changed hands, every war that was quietly won from the inside out, it happened. And at the center of it all, there was one man. One impossibly calm, impossibly brilliant, impossibly dangerous man. His name was Arnold Rothstein. And this is his story. New York City, 1882. The Lower East Side, a place where the streets smelled of fish and sweat and ambition, where immigrants pressed their children into the future with trembling, calloused hands, where every building seemed to lean slightly as if exhausted from holding so many dreams at once. This was the world Arnold Rothstein was born into on January 17th of that year, and from the very first breath he drew, nothing about him quite fit. His father, Abraham Rothstein, was a man of principle, a respected figure in the Jewish community, a businessman who wore his integrity like a second suit, always pressed, always visible, never removed. People called Abraham Abe the Just, and they meant it sincerely. Because in a neighborhood where corners were cut and promises were negotiable, Abe Rothstein kept his word. He tithed. He gave to charity. He prayed with conviction. He believed, with the full weight of his being, that a man's worth was measured by how he treated others. Arnold watched all of this. He absorbed every detail of his father's life the way a sponge absorbs water fully, completely, and with perfect retention. And from somewhere deep inside, he came to a quiet, devastating conclusion. His father's way was beautiful, and it was also a losing hand. The neighborhood didn't reward virtue. It rewarded cleverness. And Arnold Rothstein, from the time he could hold a coin between his small fingers and make it disappear and reappear at will, was the cleverest person in any room he walked into, while his older brother Harry won there. Father's approval, Arnold sat in corners and watched people. He watched how they moved when they were nervous, watched how their eyes shifted when they were bluffing. He watched which men swaggered and which men flinched, and he understood, with a child's perfect clarity, that the swagger was usually a lie and the flinch was usually the truth. He was small for his age, dark-eyed, quiet in a way that unsettled people who didn't know him and fascinated people who did. His teachers noted that he was exceptionally intelligent but disturbingly disengaged, as if the curriculum being offered to him was a meal he'd already eaten. He quit school at 16 without ceremony or regret, the way a man removes a coat that no longer fits, and stepped out into the streets of New York with nothing but his mind and his nerve and an absolute, unshakable certainty that the world was one enormous game, and he was about to learn every rule. His first gambles were small. Dice games in alleys, card games in the back rooms of candy stores. He didn't always win in those early days, but he learned something more valuable than winning. He learned the architecture of risk. He learned that most gamblers played on emotion, on superstition, on hope. And hope, Arnold decided, was the most expensive thing a man could carry to a card table. He didn't play on hope. He played on information, on probability, on the precise, clinical measurement of every variable he could observe and every variable he couldn't, and the management of the gap between those two things. By the time he was 18, he was winning consistently. By 20, he was winning. So consistently that the other players stopped being surprised and started being afraid. There's a story. It's told in more than one version, which usually means it's at least partly true. About a pool game young Arnold played against a man named Charles Kid Weller, a hustler who was known throughout Lower Manhattan as the best pool player alive. Weller had size, experience, reputation, and an audience of believers. Rothstein had none of those things. What he had was the ability to watch. Weller played 3 games before their match and identify exactly 2 flaws in his technique. Flaws. so small that no one else in the room had noticed them. When their game finally began, Arnold didn't just beat Weller. He beat him methodically, precisely, the way a surgeon removes a tumor, with clean cuts, no wasted motion, and no visible emotion. The crowd was silent at the end. Not the silence of disappointment, but the silence of people realizing they just watched something they didn't have language for yet. Weller looked at the young man across the table, this slight, unimpressive-looking kid with the dark eyes and the soft hands, and said, "What are you?" Arnold picked up his coat. He smiled just barely. "I'm the house," he said, and walked out. He was barely 20 years old when he said those words. And in that moment, without entirely knowing it, he had defined his entire life's philosophy. He would never be a player again. He would be the house. He would be the man who controlled the game, who set the terms, who held the percentages, who walked away with money regardless of who won or lost on any given night. This was not greed. This was engineering. This was Arnold Rothstein looking at the world and deciding with complete rationality where he wanted to stand inside it. His father saw the direction his son was heading and grieved quietly. The way good men grieve privately, without drama. He sat Arnold down more than once and spoke of integrity, of reputation, of what it meant to be a man of the community. Arnold listened with genuine respect. He loved his father. He understood his father's world completely, simply lived in a different one. By the time Arnold Rothstein was 25, he'd saved enough money from gambling to open his own billiard hall. It was a legitimate business on the surface, and it was, in fact, legitimate, which was the genius of it. The hall generated real income, served real customers, paid real taxes. It also served as a hub, a meeting point, a place where men of various appetites and various levels of desperation could find each other with minimal friction. Arnold stood behind the counter and watched them all, filing every face and every hunger and every weakness into the vast, immaculate filing system of his memory. He was building something. He just hadn't told anyone what it was yet. New York in the early 1900s was a city caught between two versions of itself. On one hand, it was a metropolis of industry and immigration and aspiration, a place where the great American myth of reinvention felt most alive. On the other hand, it was riddled with corruption so fundamental and so old that it had become structural, like the beams and columns of the buildings themselves. Tammany Hall ran the political machine with the casual authority of a feudal lord. Police captains collected tribute the way medieval knights collected tolls. The boundary between law and crime was not a wall, but a curtain, thin, translucent, swaying constantly in whatever wind was blowing. Arnold Rothstein looked at this landscape and didn't see corruption. He saw opportunity. He saw a system that ran on relationships, on trust, on the reliable delivery of what was promised. He saw a system that needed, desperately needed, a man of genuine organizational intelligence at its center, a man who kept his word not out of virtue, but out of the understanding. That reliability was the most profitable long-term strategy available. He would be that man. He was already becoming him, and somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean. In the chancelleries and military academies of Europe, something was already in motion that would, within a decade, hand Arnold Rothstein the keys to an empire he hadn't even imagined yet. The old world was about to tear itself apart. The new world, Arnold's world, was about to become a very, very interesting place to do business. Asterisk, there is a particular kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a uniform or carry a badge or sit at the head of a long table. It doesn't need to. It operates through convenience, through access, through the quiet understanding that if you need something, truly need it, in the way that men who have lost all other options need things, there is one phone number you can call, one name you can invoke, one man who will listen without judgment and offer, in exchange for the right consideration, it's exactly what you require. By 1910, Arnold Rothstein was that man in New York City. He had become him so gradually, so methodically, that most people hadn't noticed it happening until it was already complete. Let's be precise about what Arnold Rothstein was and was not. He was not, in these years, a violent man. He employed muscle when necessary. The lower rungs of his organization were populated by young men who understood the persuasive properties of physical presence. But Rothstein himself had an almost philosophical aversion to violence as a business tool. Violence, he understood, was expensive. It attracted attention. It generated enemies. It introduced chaos into systems that needed to run smoothly. A man who had been threatened was unpredictable. A man who had been paid was reliable. Rothstein almost always preferred to pay. What he had built by this point was not yet an empire in the classic sense. It was more like a nervous system, a network of connections and dependencies that spread through the body of New York's underground economy without any single point that could be easily identified or severed. They ran gambling operations? Yes. The most sophisticated in the city, his establishments were known for being honest, a paradox in that world, but a profitable one. Rothstein had calculated correctly that gamblers would return again and again to a house that played fair, even knowing the house maintained its edge. A reputation for integrity, even in a legal enterprise, was worth more than any single night's cheating. He financed other gamblers, lending money at interest to men who needed a stake, extracting from them not just repayment, but loyalty. A currency that, in Rothstein's accounting, was more valuable than dollars. He arranged protection for enterprises that needed to operate without police interference, not by threatening the police, but by befriending them, cultivating them, understanding which captain needed what, and delivering it without drama or delay. He married Caroline Green in 1909, and the marriage was, in its strange way, a genuine love story buried inside an impossible circumstance. Caroline was beautiful and intelligent and stubborn, and she understood more clearly than most exactly what kind of man she had chosen. She accepted it with a mixture of love, frustration, and a dignity that never quite cracked, even in the hardest years that were coming. She gave him a home that was immaculate and social, a stage on which Arnold could perform the role of respectable New York citizen, a role he played with considerable pleasure and considerable skill, because Arnold Rothstein was not just a criminal. He was a social creature of genuine sophistication. He dressed beautifully, always. He spoke precisely, with a vocabulary that surprised people who expected vulgarity from his world. He read voraciously, could discuss literature, politics, finance, and philosophy with equal fluency. He did so at the dinners and parties and club memberships that anchored him to the legitimate world. Even as his primary business floated far outside it, his circle of acquaintances in these years reads like a seating chart for history. Politicians, judges, newspaper owners, Broadway producers, hotel magnates, police commissioners. He knew them all. He cultivated them all. And I understood each of them with the same cold precision with which he understood card players, their ambitions, their weaknesses, their price. He never called in a favor loudly. He never made a man feel that he was compromised, even when the man was deeply, irrevocably compromised. He extended kindness in public and leverage in private, and the combination was devastating. This was the period when the mythology of Arnold Rothstein began to crystallize. Stories circulated about bets he had made, and won impossible bets that seemed less like gambling than like prophecy. There was the story of the horse race at Saratoga, where he bet an absolutely absurd sum on a horse no one believed in, and walked away with a fortune. There was the poker game that lasted 40 hours, at the end of which every other player had either surrendered or been financially destroyed. There was his policy, well known among those who dealt with him, of never carrying a gun, not because he was unafraid, but because he didn't need one. "I have never had to shoot anyone," he told a journalist once, with perfect equanimity. "I pay people to be afraid of me. That's more reliable." The city in these years was a place of spectacular contrasts. The Gilded Age had given way to the Progressive Era, its reformers and its muckrakers, and its genuine moral outrage at the conditions under which the poor lived. Prohibition was still years away, but the forces that would produce it were already gathering strength: the temperance movement, the religious coalitions, the rural fury at urban vice, the gamblers and the madams, and the bookmakers and the pool room operators, existed in a society that was increasingly determined to make them illegal, which was, paradoxically, the best thing that could possibly happen to Arnold Rothstein's long-term business interests. Because Rothstein had already understood something that most of his contemporaries had not. The prohibition of any human appetite does not eliminate that appetite. It simply changes the economics of its satisfaction. When the government declares something illegal, it doesn't destroy the demand, it destroys the legitimate supply in hands. The market to whoever is clever enough and organized enough to fill the gap. Rothstein was watching the reformers of the progressive era with the quiet attention of a man watching clouds gather on the horizon. He wasn't worried, he was planning. In 1911, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory killed 146 workers. Most of them young immigrant women because the doors had been locked from the outside and the fire escapes were inadequate. The tragedy convulsed the city with grief and rage. It energized the labor movement. It produced new legislation. Arnold Rothstein attended the memorial service for the dead, not from cynicism, but from something more complex. A genuine recognition that the world he operated in was built on the same exploitation and the same disregard for human lives that had produced the Triangle Fire, just with different victims and different perpetrators. He was not naive about his own place in that system, but he also had, by this point, a very specific use he was planning for the system. He had been watching the war that was building in Europe. He had been reading the newspapers, consulting with men who understood international finance, listening to the worried conversations of businessmen and politicians at the dinners where he was always, somehow, present. And he had reached a conclusion that most Americans had not yet reached. This war, when it came, would be total. It would be catastrophic. It would reshape the economies of the world. And for a man positioned correctly, for a man with capital, connections, and absolute freedom from squeamishness about where money came from, it would be the greatest business opportunity in history. Arnold Rothstein was 32 years old. He had built a network. He had accumulated capital. He had cultivated relationships on every rung of every ladder that mattered in New York. He was ready. He just needed the starting pistol. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, a young man named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots that killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. The chain of treaties and mobilizations and ultimatums that followed those shots would, within 6 weeks, engulf most of Europe in the greatest war the world had yet seen. The starting pistol had fired, and Arnold Rothstein, in his office on Broadway, heard it as clearly as if it had been fired next to his ear. He smiled, he lit a cigarette. He opened his ledger to a fresh page. And he began to write, ****, August 1914. The newspapers screamed it from every corner. War in Europe. Men gathered on sidewalks in their shirt sleeves to read the headlines aloud to each other. Women wept in doorways. Politicians called emergency sessions. Church bells rang. The general mood was a mixture of horror and distant excitement. The way people sometimes feel about disasters that are large enough to be awe-inspiring, but far enough away to be, for the moment, safe. Arnold Rothstein was not on any sidewalk. He was in a private room at Lindy's restaurant on Broadway, a place that would become synonymous with his name, a place where deals were sealed over cheesecake and coffee at all hours of the day and night. He was sitting across the table from 2 men, a textile broker named Kaufman, who moved fabric between Europe and America, and a banker named Levinson, who had connections to import-export houses in half a dozen countries. They had been summoned. In the polite but unmistakable way that Rothstein summoned people, not with a demand, but with an offer they understood could not be declined without cost. He had a theory. He wanted them to test it. The theory was this: a major European war would immediately disrupt the supply chains of every commodity that Europe both produced and consumed: wool, cotton, leather, sugar, silk. The manufacturers who depended on European suppliers would suddenly find themselves without materials. The American markets, which had been secondary, would suddenly become primary. Prices would spike. Anyone who had moved in the weeks before the general public understood what was happening. To acquire positions in American commodities would profit enormously. He had already begun to move. He'd already been moving quietly for weeks, since the assassination in Sarajevo, since the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, since the moment the dominoes began to fall in a pattern that his calculating mind had read as clearly as a racing form. He had converted portions of his gambling profits into commodity positions. He had consulted with men who understood things like freight shipping and textile manufacturing, men who owed him favors and were happy to discharge them with information. He had moved with the patience and precision that defined everything he did, but the real opportunity, he explained to Kaufman and Levinson, was not in commodities alone. The real opportunity was in supply. Once America entered the war, and he was certain America would enter eventually, despite what Wilson was saying in public, the government would need to procure everything. Uniforms, blankets, boots, bandages, tents, ammunition cases. Every physical object that an army of millions needed to exist and function. And the government, being the government, would procure these things through contracts. And contracts in America did not go to the most efficient or the most qualified supplier. They went to whoever had the right relationships with the right people and the right offices in Washington. Arnold Rothstein knew those people. He had been cultivating those people for years without knowing exactly what he would need from them. Now, he knew. What followed in the years between 1914 and 1917 was a masterclass in leveraged positioning. Rothstein did not manufacture anything. He did not ship anything. He did not, in the classic sense, produce any value that he then sold at a profit. What he did was more elegant and more profitable than any of that. He connected. He bridged. He stood between the men who needed things and the men who could provide them. And he extracted from each transaction a percentage, so carefully calibrated that no single party felt they were being gouged, while the cumulative effect on Rothstein's net worth was staggering. There were the bootleg goods, and here we must be precise, because this predates Prohibition, and the word bootleg had a different meaning. Goods that moved without proper documentation, goods that avoided certain taxes, goods that arrived at certain warehouses without paperwork and departed with different paperwork. Rothstein did not invent this practice. He organized it. He standardized it. He made it reliable enough that businessmen who would have been horrified to call themselves criminals were nonetheless happy to participate. Because the system Rothstein ran was orderly and discreet, and the alternative, doing everything by the legal book in a wartime economy snarled with regulations and shortages, was slower and more expensive. His gambling profits were reinvested continuously, never allowed to sit idle. He had an instinctive understanding of leverage long before it was a fashionable concept in finance. The ability to control large positions with relatively small amounts of capital by using debt strategically and timing exits with precision. He financed bootleggers. He financed drug dealers, primarily opium and cocaine, which were not yet illegal but were heading in that direction, and whose black market value was already climbing. He financed conmen and fraudsters, not out of moral indifference, but out of the same calculation he applied to everything. What is the risk-adjusted return on this investment? The war economy produced a peculiar social condition in New York. There was money everywhere. Government money, contract money, the money of war profiteers, both large and small, the money of workers employed in war industries, and there was an almost desperate hunger to spend it. Men who had been working 60-hour weeks in munitions factories wanted entertainment. Soldiers on leave wanted entertainment. Businessmen who had made fortunes off the war wanted to celebrate and to prove, through conspicuous expenditure, that they deserved what they'd gotten. The city throbbed with a kind of manic energy, part euphoria and part guilt, that expressed itself in gambling and drinking and every variety of entertainment that Rothstein could supply. He expanded his gambling operations accordingly, establishing what amounted to the first genuinely upscale illegal casino in American history. His establishments were not the grimy backroom operations that the word gambling den traditionally conjured. They were carpeted, they were lit, they had good furniture and decent liquor and staff who were trained to be hospitable. They catered to a clientele that included lawyers, doctors, businessmen, the occasional politician, men who would never have entered a traditional gambling operation, but who were perfectly comfortable in. Rothstein's rooms because Rothstein had made them feel correctly that the only difference between his establishment and a legitimate club was a technicality of licensing. He was also, in these years, running the largest floating poker game in the history of New York. Floating because its location changed regularly: a hotel room on Monday, a private residence on Thursday, a rented floor of a commercial building on Saturday. It was invitation only, the invitation being extended by Rothstein personally to men he had judged capable of losing significant sums without becoming emotionally unstable about it. The game ran for decades, through wars and recessions and police campaigns, and it generated a mythology of its own. Stories of single pots, worth more than most Americans earned in a year, of fortunes made and lost in a single hand of Arnold Rothstein sitting at the center of it all, still and watchful, and so utterly unreadable that veteran card players compared trying to read him to trying to read a closed book. But here's the thing that people miss when they focus only on the gambling. The gambling was not the point. The gambling was the engine that generated capital. Yes. And the social network that generated connections. Yes. But what Rothstein was building with that capital and those connections was something different. Something larger. Something that, when the right moment arrived, would transform him from a very wealthy criminal into something that didn't have a name yet in American culture. He was building what we would now call organized crime. The concept barely existed in the United States in 1914. There were gangs. Certainly ethnic gangs, neighborhood gangs, gangs that ran particular rackets in particular territories. But gangs were not organizations in the corporate sense. They were collections of violent men, united by geography and ethnicity and the mutual benefit of not fighting each other constantly. They did not have diversified revenue streams. They did not have investment portfolios. They did not have relationships with judges and politicians and import-export houses. They were raw, brutal, and, by Rothstein standards, remarkably inefficient. Rothstein looked at the gang landscape of New York and saw what a management consultant might see looking at an industry full of small, competing, poorly run businesses, an opportunity for consolidation. Not consolidation through force, that was the old way. The violent way, the way that attracted police attention and produced vendettas that went on for generations. Consolidation through finance, through investment, through making himself indispensable to enough of the right people that the idea of operating without his participation became unthinkable. He lent money to gang leaders. He bailed them out of legal trouble, provided the lawyers who kept them out of prison, and the politicians who made those lawyers' calls get returned. He taught them, sometimes explicitly and sometimes by example, that the path to sustainable criminal wealth ran not through violence but through organization, through reliable service, through the kind of consistency that built customer loyalty even in illegal markets. And in exchange for all of this, he asked only one thing: a percentage. Always a percentage. It's never a flat fee. Because a flat fee was a transaction, and a transaction ended. A percentage was a relationship. A percentage continued as long as the enterprise continued. A percentage made Arnold Rothstein not a vendor to the underworld, but a shareholder in it by 1917. When America finally entered the war, Arnold Rothstein was a millionaire. Not once over, many times over. He was 41 years old, and he was, by any honest accounting, the most powerful single figure in the criminal life of New York City. The best part, the part that would have made his father weep, was that almost nobody in the legitimate world knew it. He was Arnold Rothstein, the sportsman, the gambler, the colorful Broadway character. The man behind the curtain was invisible. Almost invisible. There were people who knew. There were always people who knew, and one of them was about to make him the most famous criminal in American history. Asterisk. 1919. The war was over. The world had survived, barely, and now stood in the rubble of everything it had assumed about itself, blinking in the sudden silence. 17 million people were dead. Empires had collapsed. Maps had been redrawn in blood. The young men who had gone away to the trenches had come back. Those who came back at all with something behind their eyes that hadn't been there before. A flatness, a knowledge, a sense that the old rules had been tried and found to be a lie, and that in the absence of the old rules, the only thing left was appetite. America in 1919 was drunk on that appetite. The economy was booming. Jazz was erupting from the South, like something that had been suppressed too long and could no longer be contained. Women were demanding the vote and getting it. Entire social order was in motion, restless and electric, and underneath all of it ran a current of something that the Puritan tradition in American culture recognized with horror, pleasure. People wanted pleasure. They had earned it with 4 years of sacrifice, and they were going to have it regardless of what their ministers or their politicians told them. Into this moment came Prohibition. On January 16, 1920, the 18th, amendment took effect, and the United States government officially prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. It was the single greatest gift that any government has ever given to organized crime. And Arnold Rothstein, who had seen it coming for years, was ready. But before Prohibition, there was the Black Sox, the 1919 World Series, the Chicago White Sox versus the Cincinnati Reds. Baseball in America in 1919 was not merely a sport, it was a civic religion, a secular prayer, a thing that people believed in with the intensity they could no longer quite bring to their actual churches. The idea that the World Series could be fixed, that the men who played the game could be bribed to lose deliberately, was not just illegal. It was, to most Americans, almost literally unthinkable. It's like learning that the ground beneath your feet was made of paper. The evidence, when historians have sifted through it fully, is not as clean as the mythology suggests. What is clear is that several players on the Chicago White Sox, Eddie Seacoot, Joe Jackson, and others, did accept money from gamblers in exchange for agreements that they would not play to their full ability in the series. What is endlessly debated is the exact chain of events, the identities of all the principals, and the precise nature and extent of Arnold Rothstein's involvement. What is not debated is that when the scandal broke, in September of 1920, the name that appeared most prominently in the newspapers alongside it was Arnold Rothstein's. He was depicted as the mastermind, the fixer, the man who had orchestrated the corruption of America's national pastime. Grand jury proceedings were opened. Reporters camped outside his apartment. His name became synonymous, overnight, with a particular kind of cold-blooded depravity, the willingness to corrupt innocent things for profit. What happened next was, in its way, as impressive as anything Rothstein had done in business. He appeared before the grand jury. He was calm. He was cooperative. He answered questions with the relaxed precision of a man who had nothing to hide. Knowing that the performance of innocence and actual innocence were, in the eyes of a jury, often indistinguishable. He denied direct involvement, acknowledged knowing some of the people involved, provided just enough of what the investigators wanted to seem helpful while providing nothing that could actually be used against him. The grand jury ultimately returned no indictment against Rothstein. The players were acquitted, controversially, in a proceeding tainted by the disappearance of their signed confessions in circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. 8 players were banned from baseball for life by the newly appointed Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, including the legendary shoeless Joe Jackson, in a decision that has been argued about ever since, and Arnold Rothstein walked out into the street a free man. More than that, a famous man, mythologized man. Newspapers had given him something that no amount of money could buy, a reputation. Not a good reputation, certainly, but a reputation so vivid, so specific, so compelling that it would outlast everything else about him. He was the brain, they called him, the man uptown, the gambler who had fixed the World Series. He didn't like the attention. Attention was expensive. Attention invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was the enemy of the kind of operations he ran. He also understood that the mythology properly managed was itself a kind of capital. The story of Arnold Rothstein, who fixed the World Series and walked away clean, that story made him more powerful in certain circles, not less. It demonstrated what everyone in his world most wanted to believe about him, that he was untouchable. Meanwhile, Prohibition had arrived, and Rothstein was not playing. He had spent the months before January 1920 doing what he always did before a new venture, preparing. He had identified the suppliers, the distilleries in Canada and Scotland, and the Caribbean that would produce the whiskey and gin that American thirst demanded. He had identified the routes, the ships, and the trucks and the warehouses that would move those goods from their sources to their consumers without attracting more official attention than the cost of bribing the relevant officials. He had identified the distributors, the men on the ground in New York and elsewhere, who would take his product and put it in front of the customers. He did not, in the classic Rothstein fashion, run any of this himself. He financed it. He organized the first wave of it. He established the systems and the relationships and the standards of operation. And then he stepped back and collected his percentages. Like a man who has planted a garden and now walks through it at leisure. While the plants do the work of growing, the men he planted in this garden were extraordinary. His protégés in these Prohibition years read like a who's who of American criminal history. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Legs Diamond, Frank Costello. Arnold Rothstein did not recruit these men in the way that a corporation recruits employees. He encountered them, evaluated them with his cold and accurate judgment, and offered them the thing they needed most: money, knowledge, and the framework of a professional operation. In exchange, they gave him loyalty and a piece of whatever they built. What they built with the tools and templates Rothstein provided was the American Mafia as a national enterprise. Luciano, in particular, was a student of Rothstein's in the deepest sense. He watched how Rothstein operated, the emphasis on organization over violence, on corruption over confrontation, on business relationships that transcended ethnic lines, and he took those lessons and applied them at a scale that Rothstein himself had never quite attempted. The national crime syndicate that Luciano built in the 1930s, the commission that organized the mafia families into something approaching a corporate structure, owed its conceptual DNA to the man he called the man who invented organized crime in America. That was not hyperbole. That was genealogy. Lansky, meanwhile, absorbed the financial lessons that Rothstein taught him with the intensity of a doctoral student. The Swiss bank accounts, the offshore operations, the money laundering through legitimate businesses, the careful management of capital across multiple jurisdictions. Lansky would spend his entire career refining and extending techniques that Rothstein had pioneered. He was, in some sense, Rothstein's greatest student, the one who most fully understood and most faithfully continued his teacher's vision of crime as finance. But while Rothstein's empire was at its zenith, while his protégés were building their own empires on the foundation he had laid, the man himself was developing a habit that would, with terrible irony, bring him down. He was gambling, not gambling in the controlled professional sense that had made his name. Gambling in the raw, emotional, uncontrolled sense that he had always despised in others. He had always maintained, throughout his career, a clinical distance. From the act of gambling itself, he was the house, the organizer, the man who held the edge. But in these later years, something shifted. Whether it was the pressure of his expanding empire, the slow erosion of his marriage, the paranoia that comes with having too many secrets to manage, or simply the boredom of a man who had won everything and needed to manufacture risk to feel alive. Whatever it was, Rothstein had begun to gamble recklessly. He had begun to lose, and he had begun, for the first time in his life, to owe people money that he couldn't immediately pay. That was new. That was dangerous. And somewhere in the city he had made his own, people were beginning to notice. Power is an interesting thing to watch erode. It doesn't usually happen all at once. It happens in small increments, each one easily explainable, each one individually insignificant. The total effect invisible, until suddenly the man who everyone feared is standing in a room, and the people in the room are looking at him differently. There is a moment, usually just one, when the king realizes that the court has already moved on. Arnold Rothstein reached that moment sometime in 1928. Though the processes that produced it had been building for years, he was 46 years. old he was, on paper, still enormously wealthy and enormously connected. He still held pieces of countless enterprises across New York and beyond. Politicians still took his calls. Judges still owed him favors. The men he had mentored, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, still treated him with the respect due a founding father. But something had changed. The empire he had built was now bigger than him. Organizations he had seeded had grown their own roots, their own relationships, their own power bases that no longer required his maintenance or his permission. The Prohibition economy had generated wealth on a scale that Rothstein himself had not quite imagined. There was simply so much money flowing through the liquor trade that even inefficient and violent organizations were rich, which meant that the particular advantage Rothstein had always offered, efficiency, sophistication, the ability to operate without drawing attention, was less singular than it had once been. And then there was the poker game, the one that would kill him in September 1928. Rothstein sat down in a card game at the Park Central Hotel. The other players included a number of professional gamblers of varying reputation, most notably a man named George McManus, who was known in the gambling world as a capable, if not extraordinary player, and more relevantly as a man with connections to figures in the Chicago organization, the Capone organization that was increasingly asserting its presence in New York's rackets. The game was high stakes. The game was, by some accounts, crooked, not in Rothstein's favor, but against him. There are versions of this story in which Rothstein was cheated, dealt cards in a fixed game that he was too proud or too rattled or too distracted to recognize as fixed. There are other versions in which he simply played badly, emotionally, impulsively, in the way he had been playing for years as his self-control deteriorated. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Arnold Rothstein lost $320,000? In contemporary terms, adjusted for inflation, that is somewhere north of $5 million. In a single sitting, he refused to pay. This was by any reckoning the most consequential decision of his life. Not the money itself, though the money was significant. The meaning of the refusal, because Arnold Rothstein's entire career, his entire identity, the entire foundation on which his reputation rested, was built on the principle that he was a man who paid his debts and honored his commitments. In a world where legal contracts were unavailable and trust was the only currency that truly mattered, his word had been worth more than other men's fortunes. It had been worth more than his own fortune. It had been the thing that made him the brain, the man everyone dealt with, because everyone knew he was good for it. To refuse to pay was not just a financial decision. It was the demolition of his entire brand. And he must have known it. He must have understood, with the calculating intelligence that had never entirely deserted him, what he was doing, which suggests something darker, that he no longer cared. That the man who had always played the long game had stopped being able to see the long game. That something inside Arnold Rothstein, some essential mechanism of self-preservation and clear-eyed calculation, had quietly broken. He claimed the game was fixed. He said he wouldn't pay for a crooked game. This was not an unreasonable position in the abstract. Refusing to honor a cheating debt was a known principle in the gambling world. But Rothstein had no proof, and in the absence of proof, his refusal looked like something else entirely. It looked like a man who had lost more than he could afford and was looking for a way out. The months that followed were tense in the way that only situations involving large amounts of money and men with violent tendencies can be tense. McManus pressed for payment. Rothstein stalled. McManus pressed harder. Rothstein consulted lawyers, consulted friends, consulted the political connections he had spent 30 years building, and found, to his undoubted shock, that fewer doors opened for him than had once been the case. The world had moved. The New York of 1928 was not the New York of 1910. The men who had once needed Rothstein desperately now had their own resources, their own networks, their own lawyers and politicians. He had made himself indispensable once. He had failed to remain so. On the night of November 4th, 1928, election night, as it happened, a night when the city hummed with the particular nervous energy of democratic process, Arnold Rothstein received a phone call at Lindy's restaurant. where he was sitting with friends as he had sat 1,000 times before, over 20 years of Broadway nights. The call summoned him to room 349 at the Park Central Hotel, a few blocks away. He told his companions he'd be back in a few minutes. He put on his coat. He walked out into the night. He was shot once in the abdomen by a bullet fired from a .38 caliber revolver. It was found in the service entrance of the hotel by a hotel employee, staggering, his hand pressed to his side. He was conscious when the police arrived. He was asked, as victims of violent crimes were asked in that era, whether he could identify his attacker. Arnold Rothstein looked at the detective who was asking. He had spent 30 years cultivating the loyalty of the underworld by never under any circumstances cooperating with law enforcement. He had spent 30 years as a man who resolved disputes through means other than the police. He was lying on a hotel service staircase, dying, and the habits of 3 decades were stronger than the fear of death. "You know me better than that," he said. He died the next morning. November 6, 1928. He was 46 years old. He was, by the standards of the era and the world he inhabited, an old man. He had outlasted most of his contemporaries. He had built something that would outlast him by generations. And he had died the way he had lived, inside the code, refusing to break it. Even when breaking it might have saved him. George McManus was arrested and charged with the murder. His trial, the following year, ended in acquittal. The jury found the evidence insufficient. The shooter was never conclusively identified. The case was never officially solved. The brain had gone silent. But the machine he built kept running. Asterisk, asterisk, when a man like Arnold Rothstein dies, the immediate chaos is predictable. The wolves circle. The alliances that held because of him dissolve or realign. The money he controlled, the investments, the loans outstanding, the pieces of 100 enterprises becomes the subject of furious, sometimes violent negotiation among those who feel they have a claim to it. This is what happened in the weeks and months after Rothstein's death. And it was messy and sometimes brutal in ways that Rothstein himself would have found both predictable and avoidable. His widow, Caroline, who had endured the impossible marriage, with remarkable dignity, found herself navigating an estate that was simultaneously enormous on paper and nearly impossible to liquidate in practice, because so much of his wealth was embedded in criminal enterprises that couldn't be declared. In a probate court, his legitimate assets were quickly identified and contested. His illegitimate assets were even more quickly absorbed by the men who had been operating them, who now, freed from their obligation to Rothstein's percentage, found themselves running enterprises they effectively owned. But the larger story of Rothstein's legacy is not about the disposition of his estate. It is about the disposition of his ideas, and those ideas did not die with him. They propagated through the men he had taught, the systems he had designed, the conceptual framework he had provided for thinking about crime as a business rather than as a calling. Lucky Luciano moved quickly to consolidate power in the vacuum Rothstein's death created. The old mustache Pete's the elderly, Sicilian bosses who ran the mafia families in New York, according to old country rules and old country loyalties, were an obstacle to the kind of modern, cross-ethnic criminal organization that Luciano envisioned. In 1931, in what became known as the Castellammarese War, Luciano engineered the murders of the 2 most powerful mustache Petes, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. It was the bloodiest internal reorganization in American criminal history, as it cleared the way for precisely the kind of corporate structure that Rothstein had advocated. The commission that Luciano established in 1931 was Rothstein's organizational philosophy writ large. 5 families operating in defined territories, resolving disputes through deliberation rather than war, maintaining relationships across ethnic lines, running their enterprises with a degree of professionalism and longevity that the old gang structure had never achieved. When Luciano was asked, late in his life, who had been his most important teacher, he said, without hesitation, Arnold Rothstein. Not for what Rothstein had given him in material terms, for what Rothstein had shown him about the way a mind could work. Meyer Lansky took the financial lessons even further. Lansky became, over the following decades, the most sophisticated financial mind in the history of American organized crime, a man who moved money across borders, through shell companies, into legitimate investments and back out again, with a facility that confounded law enforcement for 50 years. The Swiss accounts, the Bahamas, Cuba, before Castro made it impossible. The casino investments in Las Vegas that would eventually launder enough money to make the mob the de facto banking system of the post-war entertainment industry. All of it built on foundations that Lansky had first encountered watching Arnold Rothstein manage his portfolio, and then there was the drug trade. In his later years, Rothstein had begun moving into narcotics, heroin, primarily, which was flowing into American cities from Europe and Asia in increasing quantities and commanding extraordinary prices on a black market that was growing faster than any other criminal enterprise. His involvement was cautious and peripheral by his own standards. He financed shipments, arranged for distribution networks, collected percentages, but he had identified the trade as the next great criminal opportunity the way he had once identified Prohibition liquor. And the men he had introduced to it did not stop when he died. The heroin trade in New York in the 1930s and 1940s was built on relationships and systems that Rothstein had established. The importers he had worked with continued working. The distributors he had organized continued distributing. The corruption of customs officials and police that he had pioneered as a methodology was applied by his successors to the narcotic supply chain with devastating effectiveness. The heroin epidemic that would devastate black communities in New York and other American cities in the post-war decades was not something that Arnold Rothstein planned or intended, but it was something that his systems enabled. His organizational innovations, value neutral by their nature, were applied to the most destructive trade in the history of American cities. This is the darkest part of Rothstein's legacy, and it deserves to be stated clearly. The brilliant, careful, nonviolent man who had built his empire on the principle of rational self-interest, created systems that others used to devastate communities he never saw. The supply chains he designed, the corruption networks he established, the organizational templates he created, these things outlived him and were applied to purposes that caused immeasurable human suffering. He cannot be held directly responsible for what his successors did with the tools he made, but those tools are part of his legacy too. Meanwhile, the culture was processing him. F. Scott Fitzgerald had immortalized him, or a version of him, as Meyer Lansky in The Great Gatsby. Published in 1925, 3 years before Rothstein's death. Wolfsheim, who is described as the man who fixed the World Series and who wears cufflinks made from human molars, is a figure of both fascination and horror. The dark energy that underlies the glittering surface of the jazz age, the reminder that all that golden light is powered by something ugly. Fitzgerald's Rothstein is not Rothstein exactly, but the distillation is recognizable. The calm, the intelligence, the cold competence, the absolute comfort with the moral compromises that make the beautiful surface possible, Damon Runyon wrote. About him more directly, and with more affection, the Broadway Rothstein. The gambler and sportsman and wit, the man who is seen at Lindy's every night holding court over cheesecake. Runyon's characters were drawn from the world Rothstein had made, and they carried in their ribald, sentimental, theatrically stylized way something essential about that world. Its humor, its particular code of honor, its combination of genuine camaraderie and absolute ruthlessness. The newspapers made him a myth. The politicians who had known him quietly distanced themselves and pretended they hadn't. The police department that had accommodated him for 30 years conducted a performative investigation of his murder that led nowhere, because leading somewhere would have required explaining the accommodation, and that was a conversation one in the department wanted to have, and in the streets and back rooms and hotel suites of New York. The men who had learned from him kept building. They built faster now, unencumbered by his percentage. They built rougher now, because they lacked his instinct for the minimum necessary violence. But they built in the direction he had pointed, using the map he had drawn, toward an American criminal empire that would reach its fullest and most destructive flowering in the years to come. Arnold Rothstein was gone, but he was, in every way. That matters. Still there. ***. There is a question that sits at the bottom of any serious account of Arnold Rothstein's life, and it is not a comfortable question. It is this: what exactly are we celebrating when we celebrate men like him, because we do celebrate them? This story is evidence of that. The long tradition of gangster literature and gangster cinema and gangster mythology in American culture is evidence of that. From The Great Gatsby to The Godfather to Boardwalk Empire, in which Rothstein himself appears as a major character. Portrayed with considerable complexity and considerable glamour, there is something in the American imagination that is drawn to these figures with a pull that is almost gravitational. We find them fascinating. We find them in some uncomfortable corner of ourselves admirable. Why? It is worth sitting with that question for a moment rather than rushing past it. Part of it, certainly, is the pure narrative pleasure of the outlaw, the figure who operates outside the rules, who bends the world to his will, who refuses to accept the limitations that society imposes on ordinary people. This is as old as storytelling. Every culture has its trickster figures, its noble outlaws. It's men and women who achieve through forbidden means what the legitimate order denies them. But in Rothstein's case, there is something more specific. He was not just an outlaw. He was an outlaw who exposed by his very existence and his very success the profound corruption of the legitimate order. The judges who took his money were legitimate. The politicians who accepted his favors were legitimate. The police captains who looked the other way were legitimate. The businessmen who moved their goods through his networks because it was more efficient than using legal channels, they were legitimate. Rothstein was merely the most honest member of a dishonest system, the one who acknowledged what everyone else pretended not to see. There is a reason his father was called Abe the Just, and his son became the Brain. Abe Rothstein believed in a system of justice that was worth serving on its own terms. Arnold Rothstein looked at that same system and saw the machinery behind the curtain, the gears of corruption and complicity and self-interest that kept the whole thing turning. He was not wrong about what he saw. Was, if anything, more accurate about the nature of American power in the early 20th century than most of the reformers who opposed him. That doesn't make him good. It makes him clear-eyed, which is a different and more troubling thing. Clarity of vision does not imply virtue. Man can see the world precisely as it is and use that clarity to do tremendous harm, which is in the final accounting what Rothstein did. The drug networks he seeded, the corruption he normalized, the young men he recruited into a life that, for most of them, ended in violence or prison, communities destroyed by the trades he organized. These things are real, and they are his. And yet there is something in his story that speaks to an experience specific to his moment and his community. Arnold Rothstein was a Jewish man in an America that was profoundly, institutionally anti-Semitic. The legitimate routes to power and wealth that were available to men of other backgrounds were not, in practice, equally available to him. The Ivy League institutions that shaped the elite were largely closed to Jews. The law firms and banks and corporations that served as the machinery of American wealth operated hiring policies that made the exclusion explicit. The social clubs, where deals were made over drinks, would not have admitted him. He found a different door. He walked through it. Once inside, he was brilliant and ruthless and successful in ways that the people who had closed the legitimate doors to him could never have imagined or forgiven. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that runs through his story for people who have been told that their kind doesn't belong at the table, the satisfaction of watching someone build their own table and invite the people who excluded them to come beg for a seat. This is not a defense. It is a context. The harm he did was real, regardless of the injustice that shaped him. But understanding the injustice is essential to understanding the man. And understanding the man is essential to understanding the world he built. That world, in 2026, is still recognizable. The organized crime structures he pioneered have mutated and modernized, but their conceptual DNA is unchanged. The relationship between criminal enterprise and political power that he normalized is still operative. In America and everywhere else, The drug trade, whose infrastructure he helped establish, continues to devastate communities a century later. His shadow is long. And there is one more thing. One final piece of the Rothstein legacy that is rarely discussed, but may be the most consequential of all. Arnold Rothstein proved that crime, properly organized and properly financed, could be a genuine alternative economy, not a parasite on the legitimate economy, but a parallel structure that could, in some ways, be more efficient and more responsive than the legitimate one. He proved that the skills required to build a criminal empire were the same skills required to build a legitimate one. Organizational intelligence, financial sophistication, the management of human relationships, the ability to identify and exploit, opportunity, he proved. In short, that the difference between a great criminal and a great businessman was less a matter of character than of circumstance and timing. This was a genuinely dangerous insight, because once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Once you have understood that the line between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise is drawn by power rather than by ethics, that what is legal is merely what the people with power have decided to permit, the moral landscape becomes much harder to navigate. The comfortable certainties dissolve. The question, what kind of man was Arnold Rothstein, becomes uncomfortably entangled with what kind of world made Arnold Rothstein possible? And that question has answers that implicate far more people than one gambler from the Lower East Side. He was shot in a hotel service staircase on a November night, and he refused to name his killer because that was the code, and he had always honored the code. He had built an empire on the principle that reliability was the highest virtue available to a man in his position, and he remained reliable until the last breath left his body. Whether that is tragic or admirable or simply true, that is something each person who hears this story has to decide for themselves. Arnold Rothstein, the brain, the man who invented organized crime, the gambler who bet on everything and refused to fold, even when folding might have saved his life. He came from the streets of New York, and he turned those streets into his own private kingdom. He watched a world war reshape the globe and used that reshaping to build his empire. He taught the men who would define American crime for the rest of the 20th century, and he died before he could see what they made of his lessons. He was brilliant. He was ruthless. He was, in his way, a man of principle, principles that most people would find repugnant, but principles nonetheless, and he changed the world. Not the way that generals or presidents change it, the textbooks and the monuments and the official histories. He changed it from the inside. Quietly, efficiently, without a gun, without a uniform, with a ledger, a telephone, and a mind that never stopped calculating. The game goes on. It always does. Somewhere in some city, in some back room, the house still holds the edge. Asterisk, asterisk, you've just walked through 7 chapters of one of the most extraordinary lives the underworld of America has ever produced. Arnold Rothstein wasn't just a criminal. He was a system builder, a visionary, a man who looked at the chaos of his era and found within it a blueprint for something that would outlast him by a century. If this story moved you, if it made you see the world a little differently, or made you ask questions you weren't asking before, then do something with that feeling right now. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that stories like this are worth making. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are only just getting started. This channel exists to bring you the stories that don't get taught in school, the dark chapters, the complicated chapters, the chapters where the line between hero and villain blurs until you can barely see it. We have more coming, a lot more. Kings of crime and wars of shadows. Empires built in whispers. Stories that will keep you up at night in the best possible way. Drop a comment and tell us, what do you think of Arnold Rothstein? Was he a genius? A monster? Both? Neither? We read every comment. We want to know what you think, and if you want to keep going right now, if this story has opened a door, you're not ready to close yet. There is a playlist waiting for you. More stories from the shadows of history. More men and women who lived outside the lines and left their marks on the world in ways the official record barely acknowledges. The shadows of history are full of stories. We'll be your guide. Until next time, Stay curious, stay hungry, and never ever trust the man who never loses.